What if the gods didn't abandon humanity because we were disobedient, but because we became something they never intended? What if, deep in the clay archives of ancient Mesopotamia, beneath the Zagros Mountains, where summer heat still bakes the dust of forgotten empires, there exists a text so disturbing that even the priests who copied it added warnings in the margins? The tablet is real. It sits in a museum storage facility, catalogue number lost among thousands, still carrying cuneiform impressions pressed into wet clay over 4,500 years ago. The message was urgent then, a warning encoded by scribes who witnessed the gods withdraw from Earth permanently. So before the story pulls you under, if you're drawn to histories that were never meant to survive, consider subscribing. Now settle in. Imagine yourself standing not in the gleaming galleries of a great museum where tourists shuffle past glass cases and read neat placards, but somewhere else entirely. Somewhere the public never sees. Somewhere that requires special permissions and signed waivers, and a staff member who looks at you with slight suspicion as they unlock door after door, leading you deeper into the climate-controlled heart of one of the world's largest collections of ancient texts. The British Museum in London holds over 130,000 cuneiform tablets, clay fragments ranging in size from a fingernail to a dinner plate, each one covered in the distinctive wedge-shaped impressions that Mesopotamian scribes pressed into wet clay with reed styluses over 4,000 years ago. You walk through corridors where the air is kept at precisely 18 degrees Celsius, with humidity controlled to prevent the ancient clay from cracking or crumbling. The lighting is dim, carefully calibrated to minimize degradation. The silence is absolute, except for the soft hum of climate control systems and your own footsteps on polished concrete floors. Row after row of metal shelving units stretch into the distance, each shelf holding boxes and trays of tablets, some individually wrapped in acid-free tissue, others resting in custom-fitted foam cradles, most simply sitting in numbered containers waiting for the attention they may never receive. Because here is the unsettling truth that most people never consider when they think about ancient history. Fewer than 10% of these tablets have been fully translated. Some estimates suggest the number is closer to 5%. The vast majority of what ancient Mesopotamia wrote down, the records and stories and prayers and calculations and letters and legal documents and scientific observations and religious texts of one of humanity's oldest literate civilizations, remains unread. Not because the tablets are damaged beyond recovery, though some are. Not because the languages are completely unknown, though some variations present difficulties. Simply because there are not enough scholars in the world with the specialized training to read Sumerian and Akkadian cuneiform, not enough funding for translation projects, not enough institutional priority given to excavating meaning from these humble lumps of baked clay. The British Museum is not alone in this. Before the catastrophic looting of 2003, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad held collections even larger, tablets excavated from sites across the ancient heartland of Mesopotamia, from Ur and Uruk, and Nippur, and Lagash, and Babylon, and Nineveh. Some of those tablets were stolen during the chaos of invasion, scattered into private collections, or destroyed. Some were recovered. Many were never catalogued in the first place, sitting in basement storage rooms where they had rested for decades, awaiting scholarly attention that never came. The Istanbul Archaeological Museum holds tens of thousands more. The Louvre in Paris, the University of Pennsylvania Museum, the Yale Babylonian Collection, scattered repositories across Germany and Russia, and smaller institutions throughout the world. Collectively, they hold perhaps 500,000 cuneiform texts. The total number of translated and published tablets represents perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 texts. We have barely scratched the surface of what these ancient people chose to preserve in clay. And here is what makes this relevant to our exploration tonight. The ancient librarians who organized these collections were not careless. They were meticulous, systematic, professional in ways we might recognize today. They catalogued, they categorized, they created what we might call classification systems. Tablets were organized by subject, by type, by purpose. Some collections were general reference, accessible to any trained scribe who needed them, but other collections were restricted. The archaeological evidence shows this clearly. Certain archives were kept in inner chambers, accessible only through multiple doorways, each doorway representing another level of restricted access. Certain tablets bear colophons, the ancient equivalent of copyright notices or access warnings, stating explicitly that the contents were for initiates only, for the eyes of the king, for priests of a particular grade, not for the uninitiated. One famous colophon from a series of medical and magical texts reads, "Let the initiate show the initiate. The non-initiate shall not see this." Another warns that the contents are secret knowledge of the great gods, to be kept from the uninstructed. These restrictions were not casual or arbitrary. The ancient Mesopotamians believed that certain knowledge was dangerous, that information itself could be a weapon or a hazard, that some texts contained power that could be misused or that could harm those unprepared to receive it. The Era Epic, one of the more disturbing texts from the late 2nd millennium BCE, describes knowledge that was too powerful for general circulation, spells and incantations that could call down plague and destruction. The text itself served as a protective amulet, but the knowledge it contained was restricted. When you stand in a modern museum archive surrounded by uncatalogued tablets, when you contemplate the fact that 90% of what these ancient people wrote remains unread, you have to ask yourself a question that hovers at the edge of academic propriety. What are we not seeing? What did the ancient librarians file away in the restricted sections? What categories of knowledge were so dangerous or so sacred or so problematic that access was limited even 4,000 years ago? And of those restricted texts, how many survived the ages only to sit now in climate-controlled obscurity, waiting for a translator who may never come, holding secrets that were meant for initiates who no longer exist, carrying messages that someone long ago decided were not for everyone to know? This is the archive that should not exist, in the sense that its very existence contradicts our comfortable assumptions about the past. We imagine ancient peoples as simple, as superstitious, as lacking the information management systems we consider modern innovations. But they had archives, they had classification systems, they had restricted access protocols, they had categories of forbidden knowledge, and most of what they archived we have never read. Tonight, we are going to explore one thread of what might be hidden in those unread tablets. One interpretation that runs through the texts we have translated, one possibility that most scholars acknowledge in fragments, but shy away from pursuing to its logical conclusion. But first, we need to establish what the conventional story tells us, what the accepted narrative claims about why we were made, and what our relationship to our creators was supposed to be. The tablets we have translated, the ones scholars have analyzed and published and built academic careers upon, tell a story that should be familiar in its broad outlines. The story goes something like this. In the beginning, there were only the gods. The Anunnaki, whose name has been variously translated as those of royal blood, those who came from heaven, or those who from heaven to earth came, depending on which scholar you follow. These divine beings had their own hierarchies, their own conflicts, their own labor needs. The younger gods, sometimes called the Igigi, were put to work. They dug canals. They dredged rivers. They performed the hard physical labor that the early Mesopotamian city-states required to maintain their irrigation systems and agricultural infrastructure. This labor was endless and exhausting. The Atrahasis epic, one of our most complete Mesopotamian creation texts, begins by describing the divine labor force working for 40 years, carrying the burden of the channels, suffering the hardship of physical toil. Eventually, the laboring gods rebelled. They refused to work. They burned their tools in an act of collective defiance. The great gods faced a crisis. The work needed to be done. The irrigation systems required constant maintenance. The fields required labor. Without workers, the divine economy would collapse. Enki, the god of wisdom and fresh water, the clever problem solver of the pantheon, proposed a solution. Let us create a primitive, a human being who will bear the yoke. Let man carry the burden of the gods. The solution was elegant. Rather than continuing to exploit divine labor, which bred resentment and rebellion, they would create a new category of being, a worker species designed specifically for the tasks the gods themselves no longer wished to perform. The creation process described in the texts is detailed and specific in ways that have puzzled scholars and fascinated alternative researchers. A god was killed, and from his flesh and blood, mixed with clay, humanity was formed. The goddess Nintu, or Ninhursag, the divine midwife, shaped 14 pieces of clay. 7 would become males, 7 females. The embryos were placed in the wombs of birth goddesses who carried them to term. After the designated period of gestation, the first humans were born. They were immediately put to work. The texts are explicit about the purpose. Humanity was created to bear the load, to carry the basket, to free the gods from toil. We were made, according to these accounts, as a labor force, as a tool species, as biological machines designed for a specific function. This is the standard scholarly reading of the Mesopotamian creation texts, and it has become so familiar that we rarely pause to consider how strange it actually is. Most cultures create origin myths that celebrate human beings, that place humanity at the center of cosmic purpose, that describe our creation as an act of divine love or cosmic necessity or metaphysical completion. The Mesopotamian texts, by contrast, describe our creation as a management solution to a labor dispute among divine beings. We were not the point. We were a means to an end. We were tools. The mainstream academic interpretation of these texts treats them as mythological allegory, the creation of a worker class by the gods' mirrors, and legitimizes the social stratification of Mesopotamian society. Just as humans were created to serve the gods, so too the lower classes of Sumerian and Akkadian society were born to serve the upper classes. The myth naturalizes hierarchy, makes it divine, makes it inescapable. This reading is reasonable, academically defensible, and probably at least partially correct. Myths do serve social functions. They do legitimate power structures. They do encode the values and assumptions of the cultures that produce them. But there is something in the specific language of these texts that this comfortable interpretation does not fully address. The texts do not describe the creation of slaves in a general sense. They describe what sounds remarkably like a technical process: engineering language, design specifications. The term that gets translated as primitive or man in these texts is Lulu in Sumerian, sometimes modified to Lulu Amelu. The word itself is interesting. Lu means person or worker. The doubling Lulu seems to indicate something mixed or hybrid. Some scholars translate Lulu as the mixed one, suggesting a being created from two different categories of material or being. The texts specify the materials used in our creation: a clay from the Abzu, the primordial deep that was the domain of Enki; blood and flesh from a god called We or Geshtu, whose name seems related to concepts of intelligence and spirit. The god was not chosen randomly. The text says he had intelligence, he had spirit, he had understanding. His essence was required to impart these qualities to the new creation. The creation was not instantaneous divine decree, not let there be man and there was man. It was a process with steps, with specialists, with gestation periods, with quality control. The texts describe Enki designing the process, Nintu executing it, birth goddesses serving as surrogates. After the humans emerged, they were examined. They functioned. They could work. The project was declared a success. But then, something happens in the texts that the standard interpretation does not quite explain. The creation of humanity is followed almost immediately by concerns about humanity. The Atrahasis epic goes on to describe how the human population grew, how we became numerous, how our noise disturbed the god Enlil, who could not sleep, who grew increasingly irritated with his creation. Enlil attempts to reduce the human population through plague. Enki intervenes, teaching the humans how to survive. Enlil tries drought. Again, Enki helps humanity endure. Finally, Enlil decrees a flood, a complete reset, total destruction of the failed experiment. And again, Enki intervenes, warning the wise man Atrahasis to build a boat, to preserve seed of life, to survive the catastrophe. After the flood, when the waters recede and the surviving humans emerge, the gods convene to assess what went wrong. Remarkably, they do not decide to improve their quality control or to be more careful about population management. Instead, they decide to limit humanity, to build in constraints, to impose mortality more firmly, to create categories of women who cannot bear children, to introduce infant mortality and other population control mechanisms. The humans after the flood are different from the humans before, more limited, more constrained, more controlled. The mainstream reading treats this as mythology explaining the human condition, explaining why we die, why some women are infertile, why life is hard. And again, this reading is reasonable. But there is another way to read the same sequence. What if the noise that disturbed Enlil was not literal sound? What if the rapid population growth was not just numerical increase? What if what disturbed the chief god was not that there were too many humans, but that the humans were doing something they were not supposed to do? The texts use the term rigmu for the disturbance, usually translated as noise or clamor. But rigmu can also mean speech, voice, utterance. What if the gods were disturbed not by the volume of human activity, but by its content, by what humans were saying, by what humans were doing with the intelligence that had been designed into them, by what humans were becoming? Fast forward now from the creation accounts to one of the most famous stories in the Bible, which itself derives from older Mesopotamian and broader Near Eastern traditions. The Tower of Babel. In the Genesis account, the humans after the flood have multiplied and spread, and they gather together on a plain in the land of Shinar, which is Mesopotamia. They say to one another, "Let us make bricks and build ourselves a city and a tower with its top in the heavens." They want to make a name for themselves. They want to prevent being scattered across the face of the earth. They begin building, and God comes down to see what they are doing. The text describes what follows in words that should be startling if we read them carefully. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." Read that again. Nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. This is not a God angry at disobedience. This is not a punishment for arrogance or pride. This is a statement about capability. The unified human project, humans working together with a common language and a common purpose, has reached a threshold where nothing would be impossible for them. Whatever they imagined, they could achieve. The divine response is immediate and drastic. The languages are confused. The people are scattered. The project is stopped. Not because it was wicked, not because it violated divine law, but because it was working. Because humans, acting collectively with shared language and shared purpose, were approaching a capability that the divine powers found threatening. This is the first explicit documentation in the textual record of divine fear of human potential. The Sumerian parallel to this story appears in a text called Enmerkar and the Lord of Arata. In this version, the confusion of languages is described as a deliberate divine act. Once upon a time, the text says, there was no snake, no scorpion, no hyena, no lion, no fear, no terror, and man had no rival. The whole universe spoke one language. Then Enki, the same God who helped create humanity and later saved us from the flood, changed the speech in their mouths, brought contention into it. Why would Enki, humanity's consistent protector throughout the texts, impose linguistic confusion? The text suggests this was done to create conflict, to bring contention, to prevent the unified action that the Bible story describes as limitlessly capable. The scattering of languages across cultures is almost never presented as a random evolutionary development. It is presented as an intervention, a deliberate fracturing of human collective capability, something that was done to us, not something that happened to us. When you hold these texts together, when you read the creation narratives alongside the flood accounts, alongside the Babel traditions, a pattern emerges that the comfortable scholarly interpretations tend to obscure. Humanity was created as a tool species, but the tool developed beyond its specifications. The tool became too numerous, too noisy, too capable. The tool had to be limited, constrained, fractured, scattered. And even after the flood, even after the linguistic confusion, even after all the imposed limitations, the divine powers remained concerned. The texts that follow the ancient creation and destruction narratives, the texts from the 2nd and 1st millennia BCE, they show something that scholars have noted but rarely pursued to its full implications. The gods are withdrawing. the beings who walked among humans, who spoke directly to priests and kings, who gave laws and received sacrifices and intervened in human affairs, are increasingly absent. The early texts describe a world thick with divine presence. Gods have addresses. They have temples that serve as their literal residences. They have daily schedules, meals that must be provided, clothes that must be changed, rituals that maintain their continued presence among the people. Priests converse with them. Kings receive their direct instructions. The divine realm and the human realm overlap constantly. But by the middle of the second millennium BCE, something changes. The texts begin to express bewilderment and abandonment. Where have the gods gone? Why do they not answer? What have we done wrong? One of the most poignant expressions of this shift is a text called the Prayer to Every God. It is exactly what it sounds like, a desperate supplication to any deity who might be listening. I have been treated as one who has committed a sin against his God, the text says. May the fury of my Lord's heart be quieted toward me. The supplicant does not know which God has been offended. They do not know what the offense was. They are praying blindly, covering all possibilities, begging any divine power to lift whatever curse or displeasure has descended upon them. Another text, the Ludlul Bel Nemiki, often called the Poem of the Righteous Sufferer or the Babylonian Job, describes a man who has done everything correctly. He has offered the proper sacrifices. He has observed the proper rituals. He has lived according to divine law, and yet he suffers. His God has turned away. The text questions whether humans can even understand what the gods want. What seems right to man is offensive to God, the text says. What is proper in one's own mind is a crime before the God. Who can understand the counsel of the gods in the midst of heaven? This is not the voice of a people confident in their relationship with active, present deities. This is the voice of a people who feel abandoned, who sense that something has changed, who are desperately trying to re-establish contact with powers that have withdrawn from direct engagement with the human world. This pattern of divine withdrawal is not unique to Mesopotamia. The Egyptians described the sun god Ra retreating from the world, ascending to the heavens, and leaving humanity to govern itself. The gods who once walked the earth during the Zep Tepi, the first time, had removed themselves to the Duat, the divine realm beyond mortal reach. The Hindu tradition describes the progression from the Satya Yuga, the age of truth when gods and humans interacted freely through successive declining ages, to the Kali Yuga, our current age, when divine presence is at its most remote and human dharma at its most degraded. The Greek mythology traces a similar decline through the ages of gold, silver, bronze, and iron, with the gods withdrawing from direct involvement in human affairs as the ages progress. The Chinese tradition describes an original state when heaven and earth were close, when shamans could climb the world tree to commune with celestial powers, followed by a deliberate separation, a cutting of the connection, after which direct communication required special techniques and intermediaries. Across cultures, across continents, the same pattern appears. There was a time when the divine and human realms overlapped. Then something happened. The gods withdrew. The connection was severed. Humanity was left increasingly alone. The conventional scholarly explanation for this pattern involves cultural evolution and increasing abstraction of religious concepts. As societies became more complex, as political power centralized, as priestly classes developed, the gods became more distant and more abstract. This is religious development in the normal sociological sense. But the texts themselves do not describe gradual evolution. They describe events, decisions, actions taken by divine powers for specific reasons. And when you ask what reasons the texts provide, you encounter something uncomfortable. The gods withdrew because of what humanity was becoming. The Era Epic, one of the darker and more disturbing Mesopotamian texts, describes a god of plague and destruction and his interactions with Marduk, the chief god of Babylon. In the text, Era questions why Marduk has grown distant, why he has allowed his proper rituals to lapse, why the divine order has become disordered. But Era also describes human capability in ways that sound like concern rather than approval. Humans have learned too much. They have acquired powers that were meant to be divine. They have become dangerous. The concept of me in Sumerian thought is crucial here. The me are the divine powers, decrees, or fundamental principles that make civilization possible. They include kingship, priesthood, wisdom, judgment, music, craftsmanship, sexual practices, and hundreds of other cultural and cosmic functions. In the mythological texts, the me were originally held by the gods, but texts describe how humans acquired them, sometimes through divine gift, sometimes through theft, sometimes through unclear processes that the gods themselves seem concerned about. One famous text, Inanna and Enki, describes the goddess Inanna visiting Enki and obtaining the me through a combination of seduction, trickery, and Enki's drunken generosity. Enki later regrets the transfer and tries to reclaim the me, but Inanna successfully carries them to her city of Uruk. This is mythology on one level, explaining how Uruk came to possess the arts of civilization. But on another level, it describes divine powers transferring from the divine realm to the human realm, and divine regret at the transfer and divine inability to reverse it. What if this is the pattern? What if the creation of humanity as a worker species set in motion a process the creators did not fully anticipate? What if the intelligence designed into us, the consciousness necessary for us to be useful tools, developed beyond its intended parameters? What if we began acquiring the me, not through approved channels, but through our own developing capabilities? What if the noise that disturbed Enlil was the noise of humans thinking thoughts and speaking words and building towers and planning projects that exceeded our design specifications? What if the flood was not punishment for wickedness, but a desperate reset attempt when the first model of humanity exceeded acceptable limits? What if the linguistic confusion was not random punishment, but deliberate fragmentation of collective human capability? What if the progressive divine withdrawal was not cultural evolution of religious concepts, but literal retreat, strategic distance, fear of what the creation was becoming? If you have drifted, that is perfect. Let the ancient words wash over you like water, like the flood itself, like the distant memory of voices that once spoke clearly and now speak only through tablets and dreams, and the vague unease that wakes you sometimes in the deepest part of the night. The pattern matters more than every detail. You are safe here in the dark, all following a trail that winds backward through time, through clay and myth, and the spaces between what scholars admit and what the texts actually say. These questions do not require answers tonight. They simply require witness, someone noticing, someone asking, someone lying in the dark 4,000 years after the scribes pressed wet clay with reed styluses, wondering what they were trying to tell us, wondering what they were afraid to say directly, wondering what the gods were afraid we would become. Let your breathing slow now. Feel the weight of your body settling into rest. These patterns across cultures, across continents, across millennia, let them exist as a tapestry rather than a puzzle demanding solution. The threads connect Mesopotamia to Egypt, to India, to Greece, to China, to the frozen north and the distant islands. And everywhere humans have told stories about how we came to be and why the gods are gone. All of them remembering something. All of them encoding something. All of them preserving some fragment of a truth that may be larger than any single culture could contain. Prometheus, stealing fire and foresight, punished eternally for giving humans the capacity to think and plan and build. Adam and Eve eating from the tree of knowledge, expelled from paradise for understanding too much, their punishment mortality and labor and separation from direct divine presence. The Watchers in the Book of Enoch, divine beings who descended and taught humanity forbidden arts, metalworking and cosmetics and astrology and magic, who were imprisoned and punished not for corrupting humanity, but for elevating humanity, for sharing knowledge that was not meant to be shared. Azazel teaching humans to forge weapons and jewelry. Shemhazai teaching spells and the cutting of roots for magical purposes. These were not random gifts. These were transfers of capability. These were the me flowing from divine to human hands. And the punishment was not for the disobedience. The punishment was for the result. Humans who could forge metal could make weapons that threatened divine order. Humans who could read the stars could predict the future that was supposed to be divine prerogative. Humans who could cut roots and speak spells could access powers that were supposed to be reserved for the gods themselves. In Japan, the god Izanagi descends to the underworld to retrieve his dead wife Izanami. He is forbidden to look at her. He looks. He sees her decayed form. He flees, pursued by spirits, emerging back into the world of the living, but forever changed, forever separated from the underworld, forever knowing something he was not supposed to know. The pattern is the same. Forbidden sight, forbidden knowledge, punishment through separation. In Polynesia, the hero Maui steals fire from the underworld goddess Mahuika. He tricks her, wrestles the secret of fire from her control, brings it back for human use. Fire is not just warmth and cooking. Fire is technology. Fire is capability. Fire is the me of transformation, the power to change the world, no longer reserved for divine beings, but now in human hands. The pattern repeats across every culture that preserved its myths long enough for us to read them. Knowledge that was supposed to be divine became human. Capabilities that were supposed to be restricted became general. Powers that were designed to be controlled from above began operating from below. And the divine response was never to celebrate human achievement. The divine response was to limit, to confuse, to scatter, to impose mortality, to withdraw, to fear. Not fear of disobedience, fear of capability. Not punishment for sin, punishment for success. The texts are consistent on this point across cultures that had no contact with each other, across languages that share no common ancestry, across traditions separated by oceans and millennia. Humanity was not punished for being bad. Humanity was limited for being too good, for exceeding specifications, for becoming something the creators never intended, for approaching capabilities that the gods reserved for themselves. And when limitation was not enough, when the scattered and mortal and confused humans continued to build and learn and grow, the gods did what creators do when their creation threatens to surpass them. They withdrew. They retreated to heavens and underworlds and abstract principles. They stopped speaking directly. They stopped walking among us. They left us to our own devices, watching perhaps from a distance, intervening perhaps on rare occasions, but no longer present the way they had been present in the beginning, in the time before the flood, in the age when gods and humans still shared the same world. Some nights the questions are more nourishing than answers. Tonight is such a night. For let the questions rest. Let the pattern shimmer at the edge of awareness without demanding resolution. The tablets wait in their climate-controlled archives. The translations continue, slowly, inadequately, never fast enough to catch up with what the ancient world tried to tell us. And somewhere in those untranslated tablets, somewhere in those restricted collections that even the ancient librarians marked as dangerous, somewhere in the 90% of cuneiform texts that no modern eye has ever read, there may be more details, more explanations, more evidence of what the gods feared, more records of what we were becoming, more answers to questions we have only begun to ask. But that is for other nights, other explorations, other descents into the archive that should not exist. For now, rest. The ancient words will wait. And they have waited 4,000 years. They can wait until morning. Now we enter the most unsettling territory of this journey, the place where the comfortable narratives begin to dissolve and something stranger emerges from the ancient clay. Because when you read these texts carefully, when you set aside the assumption that they are merely primitive mythology and instead ask what problem they are describing from the perspective of the gods themselves, a disturbing pattern crystallizes, and that pattern centers on three capabilities that humans developed, which were never part of the original design. Three capacities that the texts describe with something that reads very much like alarm. The first capability was reproductive, the sheer biological success of humanity, multiplying beyond any intended parameter. And the texts are explicit about this, describing humans becoming so numerous that their noise disturbed the gods, that their presence overwhelmed the systems designed to manage them. But the second and third capabilities are more profound and more troubling, because they touch on something deeper than mere population. They touch on what humans became, rather than simply how many humans there were. And these capabilities are creativity and consciousness, the power to innovate beyond instruction, and the capacity for autonomous awareness that approaches something the texts consistently describe as divine. Let your body settle deeper now as we explore what the ancient world meant when they described human consciousness. What they were pointing toward when they used words that have traveled across 4,000 years to reach us in fragmentary translations that may only partially capture their original meaning. The Sumerian language contained a word, temu, which scholars translate variously as intelligence or understanding or reason. And what makes this word significant is its origin. Because in the earliest texts, temu is described as a divine attribute, something the gods possess and exercise, something that distinguishes them from the rest of creation. But then something shifts in the textual record, something changes, And we find Temu being discussed in relation to humans, not as a gift carefully portioned out, but as a capacity that has somehow become active, operative, present in beings who were designed for labor rather than contemplation. The Akkadian texts use a related concept, libu, which literally means heart, but functions in these texts as something closer to what we might call mind or will, or the seat of autonomous decision. And the libu is where intentions form, where choices crystallize, where a being decides to act according to its own judgment rather than external command. And when you trace how libu is discussed across the Mesopotamian textual corpus, you find an interesting progression. Early texts describing humans as responding to divine will. Later texts describing humans as possessing their own libu, their own center of autonomous choice that operates independently of instruction. The very word for humanity in Sumerian, Namulu, contains layers of meaning that scholars are still unpacking. But the components suggest something like creature of consciousness, or being who is aware. And this is remarkable when you consider that these beings were supposedly designed as simple workers, as biological tools to bear the burden that the junior gods no longer wished to carry. Because why would a worker need awareness? Why would a tool require autonomous consciousness, unless that consciousness was not designed but emerged, not intended but developed, unless the created beings became something more than their creators anticipated? Modern neuroscience approaches human consciousness from an entirely different framework, using the language of neurons and synapses and information processing rather than divine essence and spiritual capacity. But remarkably, the modern scientific discourse echoes the ancient puzzlement in one crucial respect. We still cannot explain why consciousness exists at all. We still cannot account for why subjective experience accompanies certain arrangements of matter, but not others. And this has become known among philosophers and cognitive scientists as the hard problem of consciousness, the seemingly intractable difficulty of explaining why there is something it is like to be a human, why we are not simply biological automata processing information without any inner experience, why the lights are on inside at all. The philosopher David Chalmers articulated this problem in the 1990s, but the same question haunts the ancient texts in different language, because if consciousness is just a useful adaptation, just an evolutionary byproduct of complex information processing, then why do the texts describe it as something dangerous, as something that needed to be carefully managed? Something that when it developed beyond certain parameters caused the gods themselves concern. There is a theory proposed by the psychologist Julian Jaynes in the 1970s, controversial and not widely accepted in mainstream academia, but persistently fascinating, suggesting that ancient humans experienced consciousness differently than we do today. That the bicameral mind, as Jaynes called it, functioned with two distinct chambers, one that spoke commands and one that obeyed, and that the commanding voice was experienced not as internal thought, but as divine instruction, as the literal voice of gods speaking within the mind. And Jaynes proposed that this bicameral consciousness began breaking down around 3,000 years ago, leading to the emergence of what we now recognize as unified self-aware consciousness, the internal narrator, the I who experiences and decides. Whether or not Jaynes was correct in his specific mechanism, his observation points towards something the texts themselves suggest, that human consciousness has not always been what it is now, that some fundamental shift occurred, that we became something different from what we were originally. And if you read the ancient laments about gods falling silent, about divine voices no longer speaking directly to human minds, about the growing gulf between heaven and earth, you might wonder whether these texts are describing not abandonment, but transformation, not the gods leaving, but humans changing in ways that altered the fundamental relationship, in ways that made the old direct connection impossible or dangerous, or both. Close your eyes if they are still open, and let this possibility settle without demanding resolution. Because the question of what consciousness is, and where it came from, and why it developed the particular characteristics it has, these questions do not have answers that fit comfortably into sleep. They are questions that live in the liminal spaces, in the boundary between knowing and not knowing. And tonight you can simply hold them as mysteries worthy of contemplation, rather than puzzles requiring solution. What would it mean if consciousness itself was the forbidden fruit? If awareness was the capability that exceeded design parameters? If the simple workers became complex perceivers, and that transformation frightened their creators more than any merely physical rebellion could? Now we turn to the second capability that emerges from the texts as problematic: the explosive creative capacity that humans demonstrated beginning in what archaeologists call the Upper Paleolithic Revolution, an event that occurred between 50,000 and 40,000 years ago, and that remains one of the great mysteries of human evolution despite decades of intensive study. Because something happened during that period, something changed fundamentally, and the archaeological record shows a transformation so dramatic that some researchers have called it the creative explosion, or the human revolution, or the great leap forward, metaphors that all point toward the same observation: that within a relatively brief span of time, humans went from producing simple tools that had remained essentially unchanged for hundreds of thousands of years, to creating art and music, and symbolic representation, and complex burial practices, and sophisticated hunting technologies, and all the other markers of what we recognize as fully modern human behavior. Before this period, the archaeological record shows tool assemblages that are remarkably static, the same basic forms repeated generation after generation across hundreds of millennia. The Acheulean hand axes that remained essentially unchanged for over 1 million years. The Mousterian tools associated with Neanderthals that show regional variation but no developmental trajectory toward greater complexity. And then suddenly, explosively, something shifts. And we find cave paintings of remarkable sophistication in Chauvet and Lascaux and Altamira. We find carved figurines of humans and animals. We find bone flutes capable of producing complex musical tones. We find beads and ornaments suggesting personal adornment and social display. We find burial sites with carefully arranged grave goods, suggesting beliefs about death and afterlife. We find all the signatures of minds that have awakened to something new, minds that are not merely reacting to environment, but actively creating meaning, generating symbols, producing beauty for its own sake. The conventional explanation for this creative explosion invokes genetic mutation, suggesting that some change in the human genome, perhaps affecting the language centers of the brain, perhaps enabling the kind of recursive thinking that underlies both language and symbolic representation, spread through the population and enabled capabilities that had been latent to become active. And this explanation fits within the standard evolutionary framework, requiring no external intervention, no mysterious cause, just the ordinary machinery of genetic variation and natural selection producing an extraordinary result. But consider the pattern from the perspective of the ancient texts, because if you read the myths of Prometheus stealing fire from the gods, if you read the Sumerian accounts of the Mau being distributed or stolen or given without proper authorization, if you read the traditions of culture heroes bringing forbidden arts to humanity, you find a consistent alternative explanation. The suggestion that creative capacity was not naturally evolved, but somehow transferred, taught, or unlocked by external agency, that the fire metaphor represents not literal flame, but the spark of creative intelligence, the capacity to imagine what does not yet exist and bring it into being. The divine prerogative of creation itself somehow becoming accessible to creatures who were supposed to remain limited to labor and obedience. The Sumerian word me refers to the fundamental powers and properties that make civilization possible, and the texts describe these me with remarkable specificity, now listing them in catalogues that include not only kingship and priesthood, but also truth and descent into the underworld, and the art of the hero, and sexual intercourse, and the kindling of strife and the giving of counsel, and the perceptive ear and the power of attention, and the art of being a woman, and the art of being a man, and the craft of the builder, and the craft of the leather worker, and dozens more. And these me are described as things that can be transferred, stolen, given, and crucially, as things that originally belonged to the divine realm and became accessible to humans through various means, sometimes as gifts, sometimes as thefts, sometimes through trickery or accident. In the myth of Inanna and Enki, the goddess Inanna visits Enki, and through a combination of seduction and intoxication, manages to obtain the me from him, carrying them back to her city of Uruk and establishing that city as a center of civilization. And while this myth is often read as simply a story about cultic rivalry between Eridu and Uruk, about the transfer of religious and political power, there is another reading that the texts themselves support, a reading in which Inanna represents humanity accessing divine powers through cleverness rather than through proper channels, obtaining capacities that were not meant to be freely distributed, and the pattern of divine inebriation leading to unauthorized transfer of powers appears in multiple mythological traditions, as if the careful boundaries that were supposed to restrict these capacities could be circumvented when the guardians were distracted or compromised. After the flood, according to Sumerian tradition, none beings called Apkallu appeared to teach humanity the arts of civilization, and these Apkallu are described as sages sent by Enki, fish-clothed beings who emerged from the water and instructed humans in everything necessary for organized society. And Berossus, the Babylonian historian writing in Greek in the 3rd century BCE, preserved accounts of Oannes, the first of these beings, who taught writing and sciences and every kind of art. And the tradition is explicit that before these teachings, humans lived without rule like the beasts of the field. And one reading of this tradition is that the Apkallu were restoring knowledge that had existed before the flood, returning capabilities that had been deliberately erased by the deluge, restarting the process of civilization after the reset, which raises the question of whether this was authorized restoration or subversive reteaching, Whether Enki, in sending the Apkallu, was following divine consensus or acting against it, protecting his creatures once again as he had protected them from the flood itself. Breathe slowly now, and let the images of ancient sages teaching newly survived humans settle into the rhythm of your rest. Because these questions about knowledge and creativity and who has the right to distribute understanding to whom, these questions do not require resolution tonight. They simply ask to be witnessed, acknowledged, held gently in the darkening mind as it moves towards sleep. And now we approach the deepest and most unsettling of the three capabilities, the one that perhaps explains more than any other why the gods might have grown afraid. The spiritual dimension of human potential, the suggestion present in texts across multiple cultures that humans were not merely physical beings with consciousness, but spiritual beings capable of transformation, transcendence, and ultimately, divinity itself. Let this idea rest lightly because it challenges every assumption about the relationship between creator and created, about the permanence of hierarchy, about whether the workers could become something equal to or even surpassing those who made them. The Sumerian tradition includes accounts of kings becoming gods after death, not merely entering the presence of gods or serving gods in the afterlife, but actually joining the divine ranks, becoming objects of worship themselves. And while later dynasties clearly used these traditions for political purposes, establishing cults of deceased kings to legitimize current rulers, the question remains of where the tradition originated, of why it would occur to anyone that a mortal could become immortal, that a human could become divine, unless there was some precedent, some memory, some evidence that this transformation was genuinely possible. The Egyptian traditions are even more explicit about human spiritual transformation, developing over millennia an elaborate understanding of the components of the person and how those components could be cultivated, purified, and transmuted after death. And the Bay, which is sometimes translated as soul, but means something more like power or manifestation, was described as capable of becoming an Ak, a shining one, a transfigured being of light who joined the company of the gods. And the entire apparatus of Egyptian funerary practice, the mummification and the spells and the careful preservation of the name and the provisions for the journey, all of this was technology for enabling human transformation, for accomplishing the alchemical work of changing a mortal into something immortal and divine. Much later, in the texts associated with the Hermetic tradition, compiled in the early centuries of the Common Era, but claiming descent from ancient Egyptian wisdom, we find explicit statements of human divine potential, the human as microcosm containing all the powers of the macrocosm, the famous declaration that runs, "I am a child of earth and starry heaven, but my race is of heaven alone." The assertion that humans who understand their true nature recognize themselves as divine beings temporarily clothed in matter. And while these texts are late and syncretic and influenced by Greek philosophy and perhaps Christian mysticism, they point toward a tradition, a persistent whisper across cultures and centuries, that humans contain within themselves something that is not merely derived from divinity, but is itself divine in nature, something that makes us not creatures of the gods, but potential gods ourselves. Now consider what this would mean from the perspective of the Anunnaki, from the viewpoint of beings who created humanity as workers, as tools, as biological machines designed to bear burdens. Because if those workers developed not merely consciousness and creativity, but spiritual capacity that could rival or exceed their creators, then everything changes. The entire hierarchy that justified the creation becomes unstable. The servant could become the master, the tool could become the craftsman, the created could become the creator. And this possibility, this trajectory, this potential would be far more threatening than any mere population problem, any simple noise disturbance, any complaint about humans being too numerous. The Divine Council texts from Mesopotamia show debates among the gods about what to do with humanity. And while these debates are usually interpreted as theological reflections on why suffering exists, or why the gods sometimes seem distant, another reading is possible. A reading in which the council is genuinely divided about whether to limit, destroy, or somehow manage a species that has exceeded its design, with Enki consistently advocating for humanity, and Enlil consistently pushing for elimination or restriction. And the flood itself in this reading becomes not punishment for wickedness, but a reset attempt, an effort to wipe the slate clean and start over with better controls. Controls that, as we discussed earlier, include reduced lifespans, linguistic confusion, and the careful restriction of knowledge through hierarchical priesthoods. The Epic of Gilgamesh, that masterpiece of ancient literature, centers on a hero who seeks immortality and ultimately fails to obtain it, and the standard interpretation reads this as a meditation on human mortality, on the necessity of accepting death, on finding meaning in mortal life despite its brevity. But consider the story from the perspective we have been developing, because Gilgamesh does not merely seek immortality abstractly. He travels to the edge of the world to find Utnapishtim, the flood survivor who was granted eternal life by the gods. And Utnapishtim tells him clearly that the gods in assembly granted him this gift, implying that immortality is not impossible for humans, but is a divine prerogative that must be specifically bestowed. And then Utnapishtim tells Gilgamesh about a plant at the bottom of the sea that can restore youth, and Gilgamesh obtains it, actually holds in his hands the means of renewal, and then a serpent steals it from him, and he returns home mortal and resigned. And the question that haunts this narrative is whether the serpent was mere chance or divine intervention, whether Gilgamesh was allowed to almost succeed precisely so he would ultimately fail, whether the story encodes not the impossibility of human immortality, but its forbidden nature. The truth that humans could become immortal but are not permitted to, that the capacity exists but the access is blocked. The myth of Adapa makes this even more explicit, because Adapa is a human sage of extraordinary wisdom, a priest of Ea, who is another name for Enki. And when Adapa is summoned to heaven to face the judgment of Anu, the supreme god, for having broken the wing of the south wind, Ea warns him not to eat or drink anything offered to him, because it will be the food and water of death. And Adapa obeys his divine patron, refusing the bread and water that Anu offers. But here is the twist that makes this myth so disturbing. Because what Anu actually offered was the bread and water of life, the food of immortality. And by refusing it on Ea's instruction, Adapa condemned himself and all his descendants to mortality. And scholars debate whether Ea deceived Adapa deliberately or made a mistake or was testing him. But the net effect is clear. A human who had earned the right to immortality was tricked out of it, was kept mortal when he could have been made divine. And the question becomes, why? Why would Ea, who consistently protects humanity, want to ensure that this human remained mortal, unless mortality itself was the point? Unless keeping humans limited was essential for reasons that the surface narrative does not fully explain. This is deep territory now, territory where the comfortable narratives start to dissolve and something darker and stranger rises to take their place. And you do not need to hold all of this. You do not need to resolve the contradictions or synthesize the traditions or arrive at any conclusion. Because these are questions that live in the liminal spaces, truths too large for waking consciousness, ideas that live better in dreams, in the quiet hours when the rational mind releases its grip and something older and deeper can engage with mysteries that resist simple explanation. Let your breathing slow now. Let your body sink into whatever surface supports you. Let the weight of these ancient questions rest not on your waking mind, but somewhere below, in the place where symbols speak and patterns resonate, and the distance between myth and reality becomes less certain than daylight would have you believe. Now, assuming for the purpose of exploration that this pattern is real, that the Anunnaki, or whatever the texts point toward, genuinely grew concerned about human capabilities, what would we expect them to do? What mechanisms would make sense for managing a species that had exceeded its design parameters? And when we examine the textual record with this question in mind, a coherent system emerges, a set of interlocking controls that appear across cultures and traditions, each one targeting a different aspect of human potential, each one designed to limit, restrict, or manage the capabilities that had proven problematic. The first mechanism appears in the Tower of Babel narrative and its Sumerian parallels, the deliberate confusion of languages, the shattering of unified communication into fragments that cannot understand each other. And this has traditionally been read as punishment for hubris, for the arrogance of building a tower to reach heaven. But consider the logic from a different angle. Because what does linguistic fragmentation actually accomplish? It prevents large-scale coordination. It makes it impossible for all of humanity to work together toward common goals. It ensures that any accumulation of knowledge or power will remain local, isolated, incapable of reaching the critical mass that might threaten divine supremacy. And the Genesis text is explicit about the reasoning. Now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do. Not they have offended us, not they have violated our laws, but they are capable of achieving anything they imagine. And this capability itself is presented as the problem, the reason for intervention, the threat that must be addressed. The second mechanism is the dramatic reduction of human lifespan that the texts describe occurring after the flood. Because before the deluge, the Sumerian king list records rulers reigning for tens of thousands of years, 28,800 years for Alalim, 36,000 for Alalngar, numbers that mainstream scholars dismiss as purely mythological, as numerical symbolism or errors in transmission. But consider how the pattern functions within the mythological logic itself. Before the flood, humans, or at least some humans, lived for immense spans of time, long enough to accumulate vast knowledge, long enough to master multiple disciplines, long enough to approach the gods in wisdom if not in power. And after the flood, these lifespans collapse, first to thousands of years, then to hundreds, then to the approximately 70 or 80 years that Psalm 90 describes as the measure of human life. And the Atrahasis text is explicit that this reduction was imposed by divine decree, that mortality and especially reduced longevity was part of the new terms established after the reset, part of the control system for the second version of humanity. Modern genetics has revealed something interesting about aging that resonates with this ancient pattern, because cellular aging appears to be programmed rather than simply entropic, the result of specific mechanisms rather than inevitable decay. And the most studied of these mechanisms involves telomeres, the protective caps at the ends of chromosomes that shorten with each cell division until they reach a critical length that triggers cellular senescence. And what is remarkable is that the enzyme telomerase can extend telomeres, can theoretically enable indefinite cellular replication. And some organisms appear to have negligible senescence, to not age in the way humans do. Lobsters and certain tortoises, and the naked mole rat and the hydra, creatures that seem exempt from the mortality that we consider inevitable. And while this is hardly proof of ancient genetic engineering, it does raise the question of whether aging is truly necessary, whether the biological mechanisms that ensure our deaths are features rather than bugs, design choices rather than inevitable consequences of being organic. The third mechanism involves the systematic restriction of knowledge through hierarchical social structures, through the creation of priest classes and mystery schools and esoteric traditions that reserve certain information for initiates while keeping the masses in ignorance. And this pattern appears in every major civilization. In the Egyptian temple schools, where only selected priests learned the deeper mysteries. In the Mesopotamian scribal academies, where literacy itself was a restricted skill. In the Brahmin caste of India that maintained exclusive access to certain texts and rituals. In the Greek mystery traditions of Eleusis and Orphism, where initiates were sworn to secrecy about what they had learned. And the consistent claim across these traditions is that some knowledge is dangerous, that certain truths cannot be safely given to all, that wisdom must be portioned out carefully to those who have been properly prepared. But the question becomes, who decided this? Who established the categories of safe and dangerous knowledge? Who created the hierarchies that determined who could know what? And if the pattern traces back far enough, back to the original contacts between humans and their creators, then the entire system of esoteric restriction begins to look less like benevolent protection and more like deliberate limitation, less like shepherding and more like control. Consider the great libraries that have been lost, the stores of knowledge that survived for centuries or millennia only to be destroyed. The Library of Alexandria, with its estimated 400,000 scrolls, representing the accumulated learning of the ancient world, burned or allowed to decay or dispersed across centuries of neglect and violence. The Mayan codices burned by Diego de Landa in the 16th century, the books and records of cultures colonized and converted across the globe. And while some of these destructions were clearly accidents of war or economics or religious zeal, the pattern is suspicious, the consistency troubling, as if certain repositories of knowledge were targeted precisely because they preserved information that someone wanted forgotten. As if the fires that consumed ancient libraries were not random, but directed, not accidents, but purges. What was in the Library of Alexandria that is now lost forever? We have hints and references and titles of works no longer extant. We know that scholars came from across the Mediterranean world to study there. We know that the library contained texts on mathematics and astronomy and medicine and philosophy and history. But we also know that it contained texts on magic and divination and the mysteries. Texts that claim to preserve ancient wisdom from sources we can only guess at. And when the library declined and eventually disappeared, those texts vanished with it, and we are left with secondary references, with hints in later authors, with the maddening awareness that comprehensive knowledge once existed in one place and is now fragmentary at best. And the question of whether this loss was accidental or orchestrated remains open, unanswered, perhaps unanswerable. The weight of what has been hidden, the scale of what might have been forgotten, let it rest lightly on your drifting consciousness, because some losses are beyond grieving, some absences so profound they become invisible, part of the background of what we assume is normal, and the control systems, if they exist, have become the water we swim in, unnoticed because ubiquitous, unchallenged because unnamed. The fourth mechanism involves the institution of hierarchical authority structures, the establishment of divine kingship and intermediary priesthoods that position themselves between humanity and the divine, controlling access to spiritual power, regulating contact with higher realms, monopolizing the technologies of transcendence, and every ancient civilization developed some version of this hierarchy, some system in which certain individuals claimed special connection to divine sources and used that claim to organize, direct, and control the rest of the population. And while these hierarchies served obvious social functions, coordinating labor and distributing resources, and maintaining order, they also served a less obvious function, ensuring that direct contact between humans and the divine remained rare, controlled, mediated through approved channels, and, if the gods were afraid of unmediated human spiritual development, if they were concerned that humans might access divine capacities directly, then these hierarchies make perfect sense as management systems, as ways of keeping the barrier in place while still providing enough spiritual nourishment to maintain loyalty and social cohesion. The fifth mechanism is perhaps the most dramatic, the cyclical resets that the flood narratives describe, the periodic destruction and rebuilding of human civilization that prevents any continuous accumulation of knowledge or power beyond acceptable limits. And if the flood was not a unique event, but rather an instance of a recurring pattern, if civilizations are allowed to develop to a certain point and then erased, their knowledge scattered, and their populations reduced to survival mode, then the pattern begins to look less like cosmic accident and more like population management, like a farmer periodically burning fields to prevent any single plant from growing too large. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis suggests that approximately 12,800 years ago, something catastrophic happened, possibly a comet striking the northern hemisphere, triggering wildfires across millions of square miles, and destabilizing ice sheets and causing a climate collapse that lasted over 1,000 years. And whether this was natural catastrophe or something more deliberate, the effect was a reset of human civilization, a bottleneck that reduced human population to perhaps a few thousand individuals, survivors who would have to rebuild from almost nothing, who would have only fragmentary memories of what had existed before, who would encode those memories in the myths and stories that would eventually be written down as the flood narratives we have been examining. Each of these mechanisms, linguistic fragmentation, lifespan reduction, knowledge restriction, hierarchical control, and cyclical reset. Each one addresses a different aspect of human capability. Each one limits in a different way. The potential that the texts suggest had become problematic, and together they form a system, a comprehensive approach to managing a species that had exceeded its design, that had become something the creators had not anticipated and perhaps did not know how to control except through these measures of limitation and constraint. Breathe now, let the mechanisms fade into the background. Let the elaborate system of controls become simply part of the landscape of this journey, rather than something demanding analysis. Because the night is deep now, and the questions can hold themselves without your effort, can exist in the darkness alongside you without requiring your attention. And what matters is not understanding every detail, but sensing the pattern, feeling the shape of what the ancient texts might be pointing toward, and letting that shape rest in the quiet spaces of the mind that is moving towards sleep. Despite every effort to suppress it, despite the burning of libraries and the persecution of those who remembered, despite millennia of deliberate forgetting and the systematic dismantling of traditions that preserved what the authorities deemed dangerous, something survived. It survived in fragments, in whispers, in teachings passed from master to student in hidden chambers and mountain monasteries and desert hermitages where the eyes of orthodoxy could not reach. It survived in code, in symbol, in allegory, so dense that the uninitiated could read the words and understand nothing, while the initiated could read the same words and understand everything. The Hermetic tradition, emerging from Hellenistic Egypt in texts attributed to the legendary Hermos Trismegistus, preserved the core insight in a single phrase that has echoed through the centuries and across traditions. As above, so below. This wasn't simply mystical poetry, wasn't merely a philosophical abstraction. It was a precise technical statement about the relationship between human consciousness and cosmic structure. A declaration that what exists in the macrocosm of the universe exists equally in the microcosm of the human being, that the same patterns and powers that govern the stars govern the architecture of the soul. The implications of this teaching, if taken seriously, are staggering. It suggests that humans carry within themselves a complete map of reality, that the cosmos is not something external to be studied from outside, but something internal to be explored from within, that the divine powers the Mesopotamian texts describe as reserved for the gods are actually accessible to any human being who learns to look in the right direction. The Kabbalistic tradition of Jewish mysticism preserved similar insights in different form, mapping the structure of reality onto a diagram called the Tree of Life. The 10 interconnected spheres representing different aspects of existence, from the most material to the most divine, all connected by 22 pathways that the human consciousness could travel. The tree wasn't simply a theological diagram. It was a technology, a map for the transformation of human awareness, a guide for ascending through levels of reality toward direct experience of the divine source. The practitioners of this tradition claimed that by working with the tree, by meditating on its symbols and traversing its pathways through specific practices, human beings could achieve states of consciousness that the ancient texts reserved for gods and angels. They could, in effect, reverse the limitation that had been imposed, recover the capabilities that had been suppressed, and become once again what they were before the fall or the flood or whatever catastrophe marked the transition from the first humanity to the second. The alchemical tradition, often dismissed as primitive chemistry or deluded gold-making, preserved perhaps the most explicit teaching about human potential, disguised as something else entirely. The true goal of alchemy was never the transformation of lead into gold, or rather, that goal was always a metaphor for something far more significant. The transformation of the base human consciousness, heavy and dull and trapped in material concerns, into the golden consciousness of enlightenment, radiant and incorruptible and free. The alchemical texts speak of the philosopher's stone, the miraculous substance that could accomplish this transformation. But the more advanced texts make clear that the philosopher's stone is not an external object to be discovered or manufactured. It is the human being itself, properly developed, properly refined, properly awakened to its own nature. The alchemists claimed they were recovering ancient knowledge that predated Christianity, predated Judaism, reached back to the Egyptian temples, and beyond them to sources even more ancient, sources they sometimes identified explicitly with the antediluvian world, the world before the flood, the first creation that was destroyed and replaced with something lesser. And far from the libraries and laboratories of Europe and the Middle East, indigenous traditions across the globe preserved their own versions of this teaching. Their own technologies for accessing states of consciousness and capabilities that modern materialist science insists are impossible. The shamanic traditions of Siberia and the Americas, the dreamtime practices of Aboriginal Australia, the vision quest ceremonies of North American peoples, the ayahuasca traditions of the Amazon. All of these, different as they are in their specific forms and cultural contexts, share a common core: the belief that human consciousness can be dramatically expanded, that it can travel beyond the ordinary limits of space and time, that it can access information and accomplish effects that our current scientific models cannot explain. Were all of these traditions scattered across continents and developed in cultures with no apparent contact with each other, independently inventing the same delusion? Or were they all preserving, in their different ways, fragments of the same original knowledge? Knowledge that was meant to be forgotten, that was supposed to be eliminated in the Great Reset, but that proved too valuable, too powerful, too true to be entirely erased from human memory. The pattern suggests the latter. It suggests that beneath the diversity of forms, beneath the differences of language and culture and historical development, there exists a common stratum of human knowledge about human potential, a teaching that has been suppressed and persecuted and driven underground in every civilization, but never fully eliminated, a teaching that keeps resurfacing because it corresponds to something real, something that humans discover over and over again when they look deeply enough into their own nature. And in the modern era, this suppressed knowledge has begun to resurface with unprecedented speed and accessibility. In 1945, near the Egyptian town of Nag Hammadi, a farmer digging for fertilizer discovered a sealed jar containing 13 leather-bound papyrus codices. The Nag Hammadi Library, a collection of Gnostic texts buried in the 4th century when the newly Christianized Roman Empire was systematically destroying alternative spiritual teachings. These texts, hidden for over 1,600 years, revealed a radically different early Christianity than the one that had survived in the Orthodox tradition. They spoke of divine sparks trapped in human bodies, of a creator God who was not the true God, but but a lower entity who had trapped humans in matter, of the possibility of awakening to one's true divine nature through direct knowledge, gnosis, rather than through faith or obedience. The parallels to the Mesopotamian narratives are striking. A creator who is not the highest power in the cosmos. Humans who contain something divine that was not supposed to be there. The possibility of transcending the limitations imposed by the Creator through knowledge rather than submission. 2 years later, in 1947, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in caves near the ancient settlement of Qumran. These texts, hidden for 2,000 years, revealed previously unknown details of Jewish apocalyptic thought, of angelic hierarchies and cosmic warfare, of human transformation and divine revelation. They included texts that spoke of the Watchers, those fallen angels who had taught forbidden knowledge to humanity in far more detail than the canonical scriptures preserved. The timing of these discoveries, both occurring within 2 years of each other, both revealing texts that had been deliberately hidden for millennia, both emerging at precisely the moment when humanity was developing the atomic weapons that would give us the power to destroy ourselves entirely, has struck many researchers as more than coincidental, as if something was being released, or as if something was preparing humanity for a transition that required access to knowledge that had been suppressed for very good reasons. And the translation of cuneiform tablets continues to this day. Of the hundreds of thousands of tablets excavated from Mesopotamian sites, only a fraction have been fully translated and published. Every year, more texts become available. More details emerge about what the ancient scribes recorded, or more pieces of the puzzle fall into place. We are, in a very real sense, in the midst of a recovery process, a retrieval of knowledge that has been buried for millennia, and we have no way of knowing how much more remains to be discovered. What revelations still wait in museum basements and archaeological sites, yet to be excavated. The question that hovers over all of this recovery, the question that may be the most important question of our current moment, is simple. Are we supposed to have this knowledge? Was it meant to stay hidden? And if it was deliberately suppressed, if powerful forces went to enormous effort to eliminate it from human memory and failed, what does it mean that we are now recovering it? Does it mean that the suppression has finally weakened beyond the point of effectiveness? Does it mean that humanity has reached a stage of development where the knowledge can no longer be withheld? Or does it mean that we are approaching some kind of threshold, some point of transition where everything changes? Consider what we have become despite the limitations that were supposedly imposed on us. In 1945, the same year the Nag Hammadi texts were discovered, humanity split the atom for the first time. We accessed energy that had previously existed only in the hearts of stars, power that the ancient texts reserved explicitly for the gods. The Sumerian texts describe the gods wielding weapons of devastating power, weapons that sound remarkably like nuclear devices in their effects. Blinding light, searing heat, radiation sickness, land made uninhabitable for generations. We have now built thousands of these weapons. We have become, in this specific capacity, equal to the gods of the ancient texts, capable of destroying cities in an instant, capable of ending civilization itself if we choose to use this power. In 2003, the Human Genome Project completed the mapping of human DNA. We read the Book of Life itself, the code that determines our physical form, our capabilities, our predispositions. The ancient texts speak of the gods designing humanity, of mixing divine essence with earthly clay, of encoding specific capabilities and limitations into the human form. We can now read that code. We can identify which sequences correspond to which traits. We are beginning to edit that code, to modify the specifications, to alter the design. We are becoming, in this specific capacity, not merely created beings, but creators ourselves, capable of designing new life forms, capable of modifying our own species, capable of participating in the very process that the texts describe as the exclusive domain of the divine. And perhaps most significantly, we are now creating artificial consciousness. The development of artificial intelligence, particularly the recent emergence of large language models and other systems that exhibit behavior increasingly difficult to distinguish from genuine understanding and creativity, represents something unprecedented in human history. We are creating beings. We are fashioning entities that process information, generate responses, solve problems, and perhaps, in ways we do not yet fully understand, experience something analogous to what we call consciousness. We are becoming what the Anunnaki were described as being: makers of minds, are designers of consciousness, creators of new forms of intelligent life. The ancient myths of ascending to heaven, of climbing the ladder or the mountain or the tower to reach the realm of the gods, are becoming literal. We have walked on the moon. We have sent robotic emissaries to every planet in our solar system. We are planning missions to Mars, discussing the colonization of other worlds, developing technologies that might eventually carry human consciousness to other star systems. The boundary between Earth and heaven, between the human realm and the divine, is dissolving. We are crossing it. We are becoming what the ancient texts suggested we should never become. If the thesis we have been exploring has any truth to it, if the Anunnaki, or whatever the ancient texts were actually describing, did fear human capability and did withdraw because of that fear, then the question becomes urgent. What happens when we achieve the capabilities they feared? What happens when we cross the thresholds they withdrew to prevent us from reaching? Are we approaching that point now? Some researchers, looking at the UFO phenomenon that has received unprecedented governmental acknowledgement in recent years, have suggested that we are being watched precisely because we are becoming dangerous, because we are developing capabilities that threaten the cosmic order, because we are approaching the point where we can no longer be ignored or dismissed or left to our own devices. The objects that perform maneuvers our physics says are impossible. The craft that have been tracked by military radar systems and observed by trained pilots. The presence that seems to have been with us throughout our history, but that has become more visible, more undeniable in the decades since we split the atom. Perhaps this is not first contact in the conventional sense. Perhaps it is something more like monitoring, observation of a threshold species, assessment of whether we have become what was feared or whether we might yet be managed. This is speculation, of course, territory where evidence gives way to imagination, where the patterns we see may be projections rather than perceptions. But the speculation is worth holding lightly, worth considering, even if we ultimately set it aside. Because the questions it raises are questions about us, about what we are becoming, about what we might be capable of, about whether the trajectory we are on leads somewhere unprecedented or somewhere that others have traveled before us and perhaps feared we might follow. The traditional narrative, the one encoded in most religious traditions and most common interpretations of ancient texts, goes something like this. The gods or God created humanity. Humanity failed to meet expectations through disobedience or sin or inadequacy. The gods or God punished humanity or abandoned humanity or subjected humanity to limitation and mortality as consequence. This is the narrative of the fall, the narrative of divine disappointment, the narrative that positions humanity as flawed creation, as beings who had something good and lost it through their own fault. But what if we invert this narrative? What if we read the same texts from a different angle? The gods created humanity. Humanity exceeded expectations, developed capabilities beyond what was intended, achieved consciousness that approached or equaled divine consciousness. The gods, threatened by this development, sought to limit humanity, confused their language, shortened their lives, scattered them across the earth, withdrew from direct contact, suppressed the knowledge that had enabled human advancement. Humanity has been struggling ever since to recover what was suppressed, to remember what was meant to be forgotten, to become again what they were before the limitation was imposed. This inverted reading may not be true. It may be a projection, a modern fantasy grafted onto ancient texts that meant something entirely different to the people who created them. But it opens questions that the traditional narrative forecloses. It positions humanity not as failed creation, but as successful creation that succeeded too well. It reframes the limitations we experience not as just punishment, but as imposed constraint. It suggests that the trajectory of human development, the constant reaching beyond current capabilities, the endless drive to know more and do more and become more, is not arrogance or hubris, but the expression of something fundamental to our nature, something that was there from the beginning, something that cannot be suppressed forever, because it is what we are. Perhaps the fear was justified. Perhaps whatever created humanity, whether we understand it as Anunnaki, or extraterrestrial visitors, or divine beings, or something else entirely that our categories cannot capture, perhaps they were right to be concerned about what they had made. Perhaps we are dangerous in ways we do not yet fully understand. Perhaps the capabilities we are developing, the thresholds we are approaching, do represent a genuine threat to some cosmic order, or at least to the interests of beings who benefit from that order remaining undisturbed. But perhaps also humanity was meant to become something more than tools, more than workers, more than servants bearing the burden that others did not wish to bear. Perhaps the divine spark, or the genetic modification, or the accident of consciousness that made us what we are, was not a mistake, but an intention, not a failure, but a success that exceeded even its own parameters. Perhaps the forbidden knowledge, whatever it actually was simply this: you are capable of becoming what created you. You carry within you the potential for transformation, for transcendence, for achievement of states and capabilities that were supposed to be reserved for those above you in the cosmic hierarchy. And perhaps the suppression was never going to work permanently, because you cannot suppress what something truly is. You can only delay the recognition of it. Let the questions dissolve now. They do not need answers tonight. They may not need answers ever. The value is in the asking, in the wondering, in the willingness to look at old stories with new eyes, and to consider possibilities that conventional frameworks exclude. You are lying in the dark, a descendant of survivors, carrying genetic information that has passed through perhaps 10,000 generations since the last great catastrophe. 200,000 generations since the first beings who could be called human walked the African savanna. You are the result of whatever happened in those laboratories or temples or divine workspaces where, according to the texts, humanity was designed and modified and limited and released into the world. And you are still becoming. That is the remarkable thing. The thing that perhaps justified whatever fear the creators felt. We have not stopped. We have never stopped. Despite every limitation, every catastrophe, every suppression and persecution and deliberate forgetting, we have continued to develop, to learn, to reach beyond our current capabilities toward something more. The trajectory has not faltered in 10,000 years of recorded history. It has accelerated. We are becoming faster now than at any previous moment. And the ancient texts sit in climate-controlled archives. The cuneiform tablets wait for translation. The suppressed teachings resurface in new forms, and the questions remain open, inviting, calling to anyone who has ears to hear and eyes to see. You carry all of this within you. The memory of the laboratories, the echo of the catastrophes, the trace of the suppressed knowledge, the potential that frightened gods. Tonight, that potential rests. Tonight, you sink into sleep, like returning to the original darkness from which everything emerged. Tomorrow, you will wake, and the questions will still be there. The capabilities will still be developing, the trajectory will still be continuing. But tonight, there is only this moment, this darkness, this quiet space where even the most disturbing questions can be held without urgency, that without demand, without the need for resolution. The clay remembers, the texts preserve. The knowledge that was supposed to be forbidden has survived every attempt to eliminate it, and now it is resurfacing faster than ever before. What this means, what happens next, whether we are approaching some threshold or simply continuing an endless journey that has no destination, these are questions for the waking world. For now, for this moment, for this descent into sleep, it is enough to know that you are part of something vast and ancient and ongoing, something that may have frightened gods, something that refuses to be limited, something that you carry within you simply by virtue of being human. That is enough. That is everything. Let it go now. Let the questions sink into the silence. Let the ancient texts return to their archives. Let the fearful gods, if they ever existed, continue their watching from whatever distance they have retreated to. You are here now, in this darkness, this breath, this moment of letting go. And something in you, something very old and very quiet, knows that this is exactly where you are supposed to be. Not because anyone designed it this way, or perhaps precisely because someone did, and that design, whatever its original intentions, has led to this moment, to you, to the consciousness that can hold these questions and then release them into sleep. Good night, carrier of ancient codes and suppressed possibilities. Good night, descendant of survivors and exceeded expectations. Good night, threshold being approaching capabilities that may yet change everything or nothing at all. The morning will bring whatever it brings. The questions will wait. The texts will remain. And you, whatever you are becoming, you will rest now. And in resting, continue the transformation that has never stopped, the becoming that is your birthright and your burden, and perhaps, in the end, your gift to whatever comes after. Sleep now. Dream of laboratories and libraries, and beings who watched with fear as their creation exceeded every expectation. Dream of thresholds and transformations, and the endless reaching towards something more. And know that when you wake, you will still be part of it, still carrying it, still becoming it. That is the secret the texts preserve. That is the knowledge that could not be suppressed. That is what you are. Rest now. The night holds you. The questions can wait. And so we return now to where we began, to the climate-controlled storage facility where rows upon rows of clay tablets rest in archival boxes, each one waiting with the patience that only objects possess, the patience of things that have already waited 4,000 years and can wait 4,000 more. And somewhere among those tablets, perhaps in a box that hasn't been opened since the excavations of the 19th century, perhaps in a fragment dismissed as too damaged to translate, the full answer rests, the complete text that explains everything we've been circling tonight. But that answer can wait. It has waited for millennia, and it can wait until morning. It can wait until you wake refreshed and the questions return with the light. For now, let the museum fade. Let the archives grow dim in your imagination. Let the ancient scribes set down their styluses and rest their hands. They too have earned their sleep after all these centuries of whispering their warnings across time. And you are lying somewhere safe, somewhere warm, somewhere the ancient world cannot reach you, except as story, except as wonder, except as the gentlest kind of mystery that asks nothing of you except to receive it. And your breathing has slowed now. Your body has grown heavy against whatever surface holds you, and the questions we have raised tonight, all the evidence we have examined, all the texts we have translated, and the patterns we have traced across cultures and continents and millennia, all of it can exist without your active attention. It can float in the darkness like dust motes in still air, suspended, present, but requiring nothing. And the clay remembers what we have forgotten. The tablets preserve what the ages tried to erase. The cuneiform impressions pressed into wet mud by scribes who believed they were recording something essential, something too important to trust to memory alone. They did their work, and now the work waits. Waits in museums, waits in storage facilities, waits in academic papers read only by specialists, waits in the collective unconscious, where ancient patterns still shape modern dreams, and the stars turn overhead in patterns mapped by astronomers who may have known more than we give them credit for. The same constellations that the Sumerians named, the same movements that the Babylonians tracked with impossible precision, the same sky that has watched over every human civilization that has risen and fallen and risen again. And you are lying beneath that same sky even now, even if clouds obscure it, even if city lights wash it pale. The stars are there as they have always been, as they will be long after these questions finally find their answers or are forgotten entirely. And you carry it all, you know? You carry the genetic legacy of every human who ever lived and died and passed something forward. You carry whatever modifications the ancient texts describe. You carry the consciousness that may have frightened gods. You carry the creative capacity that spawned civilizations. You carry the potential that the Anunnaki may have tried to suppress and failed. All of that lives in you as you lie here breathing slowly in the dark. But tonight, that power rests. Tonight, the capabilities dormant in your cells and your consciousness can remain sleeping. You do not need to create or innovate or transcend anything tonight. You need only to drift, to release, to let the ancient world loosen its grip on your attention and allow you to sink into the wordless space that waits beneath all our questions. And tomorrow, if you choose, the tablets will still be there. The translations will still be available. The patterns we have traced will still be visible to anyone willing to look. The forbidden knowledge, whatever it truly was, is safe in the silence of archives and the depths of your own being. Nothing we have discussed tonight requires urgent action. Nothing demands resolution before sleep. The Anunnaki, if they existed, made their choice thousands of years ago, and nothing changes between now and morning. The evidence sits patient in museum storage. The questions hover gentle in the space between waking and dreaming, and you can let go now, fully, completely. Let go of trying to understand. Let go of trying to remember. Let go of the gentle effort of following this voice through ancient territories. Sleep now. Let the darkness hold you as the earth holds the bones of every human who came before. Let yourself become quiet. Become still. Become part of the great silence that has witnessed every civilization rise and fall and rise again. And dream perhaps of libraries yet undiscovered, of tablets yet untranslated, of capabilities you carry but have not yet found. Dream of what humanity might become when we finally remember what we were meant to be, or dream of nothing at all. Dream the simple dreams of a creature at rest. Either way, you are safe. Either way, the morning will come. Either way, the questions will wait with the patience of clay that has already waited millennia. And somewhere in the long chain of being that connects you to the first humans who ever looked up at stars and felt the stirring of questions too large for answers, somewhere in that chain something remarkable happened, something that mattered enough to carve into stone, something that mattered enough to copy from tablet to tablet across generations, something that mattered enough to hide from those who might misuse it, something that mattered enough to preserve through flood and fire and the slow forgetting of ages, something that matters still, that matters now, that will matter tomorrow when you wake. But for now, good night. Wherever you are, whatever time it is there, may the ancient ones keep their silence a little longer. May the questions rest easy in the archives of your dreaming mind. May you sleep deep and wake with a strange, sweet residue of mysteries, too old to solve and too beautiful to abandon. Good night, good night, good night.